Ohio people with Mennonite views, and they're gonna give us some missional news. Ohio Conference Cast.
You are listening to Ohio Conference Cast, a podcast dedicated to sharing missional stories and other information about Ohio Mennonite Conference.
Hello, I'm Greg Bowman.
And I am Gregory Battle. And we are
from Grace
and
Groundings. Hello, this is the second in a series of podcasts created by Grace and Groundings, the racial reconciliation resource team of the Ohio Mennonite Conference. Our hope is that these conversations can spark deeper reflection on issues of social justice and righteousness. Your hosts today are two Gregs from Grace and Groundings. Greg Battle is an elder and digital worship arts minister at Lee Heights Community Church in Cleveland. For this podcast, he has agreed to go by Gregory so we can tell who's who. I'm Greg Bowman, a food and farm writer, formerly with Midway Mennonite Church in Columbiana, Ohio. I live now in Harrisonburg, Virginia.
Our first podcast examined the challenges of being a new resident of Ohio for people coming from different cultures and countries. Good morning. My name is Gregory Battle. We looked at how Christians can provide welcoming hospitality in ways that touch hearts and lives. Here we're going to discuss the topic of food and feeding folks. Today we will explore why so many of our Ohio neighbors have a hard time getting food that is affordable, nutritious, culturally acceptable, and accessible. We are fortunate to have online Dr. Brandy Phipps, an associate professor at Central State University in Wilberforce, Ohio. She works in collaboration with leaders and throughout Ohio and other Midwest states to create new options for people to grow and access food in ways that support community, health, justice, dignity, empowerment, and self-reliance.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me.
In a few words, would you describe the issues of hunger in so many communities in Ohio?
Sure. So as we get started, I think it's really important. There are different terms that are out there related to hunger and food and growing food. And I always think it's important to kind of talk about those terms at the beginning so that we're all on the same page. I'm sure that most of your listeners have probably heard the term food desert. And the definition of a food desert is coined by the USDA, the Economic Resource System. And I'm using a definition from October of 2022. And it says that a food desert is a low-income tract with more than 500 people, or 33% of the population, living more than half a mile if urban, or more than 10 miles if rural, from the nearest supermarket, supercenter, or large grocery store. So that's kind of what we think about is food deserts. And then people talk about food access, which is typically an individual or a household or a community's relationship with a food desert. And so while that has been commonly used for decades, there are some problems that people in the food justice movement have kind of noticed over the years. And some of those problems are that it implies an inferiority location. So while, yes, maybe according to this one metric of how close they are to a supermarket, they're considered lacking, but it ignores the many positive assets that may exist related to things other than food, but also related to food in that community. For example, it doesn't take into account farmers markets, community gardens, people growing their own food on balconies, or other aspects of the local food system because it's focusing only on one metric. And of course, we can't expect every term to encompass everything, but it is important to think about and to acknowledge the problems with different terms, right? And so the second big issue is that it implies a natural setting, right? When we think of a desert, we think of a natural ecological phenomenon, right? you have the tropics, you have a desert, right? You have a beach. And so it implies that it's a natural setting and a naturally occurring phenomenon when we know that food deserts are anything but naturally occurring phenomenon. They are built environments that have many, many historical and current factors contributing to them. And so because the term food desert has some issues associated with it, we've started to use some different terms, right, in the food justice and community food movement. And one of those is the term food apartheid. I learned about this through an article in Guernica, which was an article by a woman named Anna Brones, and she interviewed Karen Washington in May of 2018, who has been a longtime farmer and food justice advocate. And she talked about food apartheid. And so food apartheid can make people very uncomfortable when they first hear the word. And I think to me, that's kind of the point, right? It's saying this isn't a naturally occurring phenomenon. This isn't a, oh, well, that's just how things are. That's how they've always been. It acknowledges that it's a built environment. And if you acknowledge that it's a built environment, then you also are acknowledging that we have an opportunity and an obligation, right, to address that built environment to create something better, right? And so I really appreciate the term food apartheid. I also appreciate the word food sovereignty rather than food access, right? So food access and food security, I think of those as end goal terms. We want everybody to have access and the ability to have healthy, nutrient-dense foods that contribute to their quality of life mentally, spiritually, emotionally, and physically, right? Food sovereignty, we talk about as a way to get, an ethical way to get to food security, right? If the goal is that everybody has the ability to have the food they need that's nutrient-dense and contributes to quality of life, food sovereignty says, a positive and ethical way to do that is by giving everybody the right and the opportunity to how their food is grown, where it is grown, how it is distributed, and to have power and control over all of the aspects or many of the aspects of their food system and how they get the food. And so again, food sovereignty is not a term that I came up with. It was originally coined by La Via Campesina, which was the peasant movement way back when, and has been continually affirmed and reaffirmed over many decades at this point. And then the last term I want to talk about is food justice. So if we say that food apartheid is this unfortunate built system that we've created that we need to address, if the end goal is food security for every person and community and household in the world, but in Ohio as well, and then food sovereignty is a positive ethical way to get to food security, right, and battle food apartheid, then food justice is the idea of making sure that we do this right in every step of the way. So food justice doesn't just think about the end user getting food. It thinks about how did the food get to them? How are we treating workers? How are we treating the people who work on the farms? How are we treating the people in retail? Do we have living wages? Do we have appropriate health care? Do we see an increase in cancer risk because people are working with certain pesticides to harvest the food that the rest of us are eating? So food justice takes this very holistic approach that says, yes, we want security. Yes, we want food sovereignty, but we have got to do this in a way that is honoring and kind and loving to every single person and to the soil and the water and the earth and creation from beginning to end. And so that's really, I think, kind of encompasses the big picture. And before we kind of move on, you know, since we're talking about Ohio in particular, we're not talking about the South, which has its own sort of history baggage associated with food and food security. We can't talk about poverty and food apartheid without mentioning the Great Migration and the redlining that followed, and how redlining and other racist practices and policies have disadvantaged minorities since the early 1900s and before that, right, in Ohio and other Midwest areas. And many, many studies in the past few years have directly linked redlining to food injustice, to health injustice, to the lack of clean air, clean water, tree cover, green space, all kinds of things that are both tangential to food, but also directly related to food when we think about food space, clean water, clean soil, et cetera, and the ability for people to grow their own food. And so I think that as we kind of move forward in this discussion, right, and we're talking about activities related directly to food, I think we would be remiss to not encourage our listeners to also think about other policies that may remain in place in their own communities that they may have the privilege and the voice to be able to start moving some of those policies in different directions to love and support other members of their community who perhaps don't have the same power and voice that they might have.
Brandy, you've really opened up the rich life of a person who spends their life with food and thinking about food justice and communities. The churches we represent are mostly rural, while some of them are in downtown and suburban areas. How can individuals or communities or even small groups within these churches make a difference in our areas? Who are the people we should be looking for to join up with in our community, in our county, or in our regions?
So first of all, I really appreciate the phrasing of your question, because you didn't say, what can we start? Like what can we create to do something good? You said, how can we find the people that are doing this work? And how can we, you didn't say this, but what I heard is how can we leverage our resources in order to facilitate and uplift the work that's already happening? And I think that's a really, really, really important thing that I don't think can be overstressed, is that, like Mr. Rogers said, look for the helpers, right? There are always people that are already doing this work. And quite frankly, I would also add a layer to say, look for the people that are doing the work that are the ones most impacted by the work. And so if we're talking, for example, about African-American communities that might be in East Cleveland, Ohio, well, there are people that are doing work that are Black-owned philanthropists, Black-owned businesses that are doing this work to uplift their own communities. And I would say, even if it might be a little bit uncomfortable for you to approach or get involved, if you can humbly approach, first find the people that are doing the work, and it could take a little bit of digging. Secondly, approach with as much humility as you possibly can to say, even if it's, I have approached people to say, I don't know what I'm doing, but I know that what you're doing is phenomenal. Tell me what to do. If it's scrubbing floors so that you have extra time so that you can go do something, I will scrub the floors for you. If it is packing boxes so that you can go speak at town council events, then I will pack the boxes for you.
How can I help? Right.
Exactly. That's my motto. And that's the motto that I always share with others is, how can I help? But just to give you a little more specific places that people could look at, I just looked up some different organizations that are doing food justice in Ohio in specific areas. I have worked directly with some of these. I have not worked with some of these. And so I want to be clear that I have not personally vetted these organizations. I think that is certainly something that all of our viewers should do, or all of our listeners should do on their own, as we do with everything, right? And make sure that whatever organization you work with, it feels like a good alignment with your values, et cetera. But I would also encourage you that even if people don't align perfectly, if you can still support the good, even if every single little bullet point doesn't align perfectly. And so just, again, some areas that I found, there's a group called Stark Fresh in Canton, Ohio. There's a group called Local Matters in Columbus, Ohio. There's a group called the Growing and Growth Collective in Columbus, Ohio. There's a group in Cleveland, Ohio called Ridall Green Partnership. There's Nourishing Power Network, which is supported through Case Western Reserve, some funding there, but they're out of Cleveland as well. They're a community-based network. And I think this might be how you found me, but the Mahoning Food Access Initiative in Youngstown, Ohio is doing some work as well. And then I also found a group, again, I have not vetted this fully, but I did look through it. It's a faith-based organization called the Hunger Network in Ohio. The reason I wanted to mention this is while many of the other groups that I mentioned are really doing work supporting growing in their areas and supporting growers and actually that kind of direct access to food, when I looked at the Hunger Network Ohio, they really focus on addressing food justice as more than just building a grocery store or finding access, that they are really working on those policy issues that we kind of mentioned earlier in this interview. They might be, and they look to be interdenominational, right? And so that might be a good way for people who maybe aren't able for physical reasons or other reasons to be able to get out and help with growing or doing kind of physical activities to support, but they're interested in policy, right? They like to have an influence on policymakers, town councils, et cetera. And so that would be another way, again, is what are you doing in your specific area to make sure that policies don't continue to exist that disadvantage certain groups while benefiting other groups. And so there are probably people in your area, again, that are doing this work. And I would say, think about what your gifts are, what your natural passions are, and contribute those to different groups, but then also be willing to step out of your comfort zone a little bit and maybe learn to do some things and advocate in ways that maybe are not necessarily natural for you, because we all can use a little bit of growth in different areas as we try to do the right thing moving through life.
Okay, very good. I'd like to ask, how does a person, an individual, try to get started? Is there any type of financial resources that they might be able to acquire? Any direction about what they can do in their homes for sustainable farming? I mean, trustworthy information that would empower individuals to at least try for themselves while they're looking for other ways to attain vegetables and fruits and herbs and seasonings.
Yes, absolutely. I'm so glad that you asked that question. And so first of all, the places that I mentioned, for example, Growth and Growing Collective, Rid-All Green Partnership, Nourishing Power, all of those places often have programs available that, whether it's space in a community garden, whether it's providing seeds, some places will have programs where at the beginning of the growing season, they'll have pots for people who don't have green space, but maybe they have a balcony or a front porch or a little area between their front porch and the sidewalk where they can grow some things. The other place that I would recommend is a lot of local universities, especially universities that have nutrition and agriculture programs, will have divisions that are outreach divisions. And so at a place like Ohio State or Central State, where I am, we are what are called land grant universities. And we have the USDA or land grant calls outreach extension. So if you looked up Central State Extension, you can see that they have a whole division within Extension for ag and natural resources. And so I can tell you that I've personally worked with Extension on a program that provided plots to people who wanted to become new producers, and they went through a certificate program, which helped them both on the business aspect as well as the growing aspect. They got to explore different methods and types of growing so that they could find what was the best fit for them as far as growing. They developed community, and one of the cohorts actually formed their own co-op and is continuing to grow outside of the program. And so I would say that for people that are interested, certainly they could look at and reach out to Central State University's extension program in the state of Ohio. We have community educators in every region of Ohio, and so there are definitely going to be programs available there. I would also recommend, like I said, looking at some of those people that are doing the food work in their area who, like I said, often are willing and ready to offer support and looking for funding to be able to help individuals to get started.
And there's so much to do. There's so much that we can talk about. I pray that we can have another meeting that you would come back, especially if you'd like to contact or send a message to our membership in the Ohio Mennonite Conference. We really appreciate it.
I am so thankful that I was able to join you. I appreciate the work that you're doing. I appreciate your hearts, and I feel blessed that I was able to spend a little time with y'all today.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Dr. Phipps, you have given us many ways to think about what it means to feed the hungry, including dignity, building community, and racial equity. We wish you well in your teaching, research, and community leadership roles. Check back, listeners, next month for another Grace and Groundings podcast on shalom and social righteousness. Signing off for Gregory Battle, this is Greg Bowman. Have a great week.
Ohio people with Mennonite views, and they're gonna give us some missional news. Ohio Conference Cast.
Thank you for listening to another edition of Ohio Conference Cast. We would love to hear from you. Our email is ohioconferencecast@gmail.com. Ohio Conference Cast is brought to you by the Ohio Conference Leadership Team, along with Norm Sohar, sound engineer, Megan Sohar, voiceover, Ann Lehman, publisher, and our many guests and listeners.